How to Steal Millions, Part 3. In California, the four directors of the Central Pacific, known as the Big Four, were working some schemes of their own. The Pacific Railroad Act declared that the government would pay the railroad companies extra for each mile of track built through mountains. This was fair, since it was far more difficult and expensive to construct railroads through mountains. It gave the Big Four an idea. The Sierra Nevada slopes began rising about 20 miles east of Sacramento, but the Big Four hired an expert geologist to declare that the mountains actually started just 7 miles east of town. To non-experts, the land looked flat, but the expert insisted it was really a mountain. The Big Four sent the geologist's report to Washington, charging the government the higher rate to build tracks over this mountainous land. And the Central Pacific collected an extra $500,000 in government payments. "There is cheating on the grandest scale in all these railroads," declared the New York Herald. Theodore Judah agreed, and as the railroad's chief engineer, he refused to accept such bogus profits. He charged into the offices of the Big Four, and some serious shouting matches followed. Angry and frustrated, Judah sailed from California to New York in October 1863. His hope to find new investors to buy the Central Pacific. He started feeling feverish while crossing Panama, and by the time he reached New York City, he was flat on his back and barely conscious. His wife Anna had him carried ashore and put in a carriage. "I kept him up by dipping my finger in the brandy bottle and having him take it that way," she said. This was about all Anna could do for her husband. He died of yellow fever a week later, at age 37, and was buried beneath a tombstone that read, "He rests from his labors." Who's going to build this thing? Judah may have rested, but the race he had started was just beginning. For a race, it was off to a pretty slow start. When work began in Sacramento, people gathered to cheer and wave signs that said things like, "Little Indian boy, step out of the way of the big engine." This cruel motto captured the mood Americans sensed that this railroad was going to change the country forever. Assuming it could actually be built, that is. There were no factories in California yet, so the Central Pacific had to get nearly all of its supplies shipped from the east: locomotives, train cars, iron rails, even the nails. Collis Huntington had the job of buying supplies in New York City and shipping them to his partners in California. One of the Big Four, Huntington really was big, over 6 feet tall and 250 pounds. His son, he bragged, was even bigger. "My son weighs 275 pounds. My son is 16. His attitude was big, too. It had to be. He often bought supplies for the railroad with no idea how he was going to pay for them. "I have gone to sleep at night in New York," he said, "when I had $1.5 million to be paid by 3 o'clock the following day, without knowing where the money was coming from, and slept soundly." That's the attitude you need when you take on a project this huge. You also need people to do the actual work. That was becoming a problem. When the Central Pacific advertised for 5,000 workers, only 800 showed up. After a couple weeks of swinging picks and shovels, many of the men collected their pay and quit to try for easier earnings in the gold mines. Meanwhile, across the West in Nebraska, the Union Pacific was moving only a tiny bit faster, laying just 20 miles of track by 1864. Like Central Pacific, the UP had a hard time finding workers. A little something called the Civil War was going on back east. That kept a few million American men busy. The UP was about to face another problem, as a young engineer named James Evans realized while planning the railroad's route through western Nebraska. Evans watched a group of Lakota warriors ride up to his crew. The chief got right to the point. "I do not like the idea of your coming here. This is the Indians' country." That pretty much sums up the trouble. The planned route of the Union Pacific sliced through hundreds of miles of Plains Indians' land. These nations had horses and guns and thousands of young men who knew how to use them. No wonder government leaders worried about what they called the Indian problem.